Hi, I'm Janet Hubble, and I'm the Director of Services to Students with Disabilities here at Our Lady of the Lake University. I'm here to talk about accessibility and accommodations for students in the online and traditional learning situation. Recently, we moved our learning to online, and that has caused I'm sure, some challenges for professors and students because the format that we have to use is different. So, what I'm thinking today is we can talk about the way to maximize the accessibility for students. So, one thing to think about is, does your student maybe have, or do you have students that have a need to use reading software or some kind of screen reader or things like that? So when you do have that for a student accommodation, you want to think about the format that you're providing to the students and how is that format going to be able to be read using a screen reader. For example, if you're using PowerPoint, which a lot of us do for our lecture notes and that kind of thing. So when you use PowerPoint, one thing you can do is go to Tools, and there's one that says under Tools, check accessibility. And when you do that, a screen will appear on the right side and it will tell you any concerns that it might have as far as if there's a contrast that's hard to read, or if it's unclear what direction the text should be read, anything like that. Those are important considerations because if you're using a screen reader, it needs to know what direction you are moving in for your notes. So while a beautiful, creative PowerPoint is wonderful and pleasing to our eyes, it's not always pleasing to our ears. And I know that sounds silly, but if you are thinking about how you want that information conveyed, you have to think about what it looks like. So I do encourage you to use the tools and check the accessibility. Also, you can, when you're adding an image, you can also add the alternate text format. And what that means is if a student has an impairment to where they might not be able to see the picture, the alternate text will tell them what the picture is. It's a description of. So if you need more help with that, I can help you, or we also have some other tutorials, but I just wanted to give you that idea. Another thing to think about is when you're looking at a student who might have a visual impairment or even a reading impairment, they may need to have larger print. And they can a lot of times do that on their own. If they're looking at something that you've provided, they can change the settings on their own machine to make that larger. But if you're providing something like, say, something that they have to complete and return, maybe a document that they have to write on or type on and then send back to you, do think about how that formatting can be done and how you would format theirs. Additionally, people with visual impairments often have trouble with contrast, or they may need contrast depending on the degree of their visual impairment. So I've seen where sometimes people would like it's easy for them to read like a black screen with white print, or something with a larger, thicker font. So just kind of think about those things. And I'm not saying you have to change everything, but just kind of consider the needs of your various students, consider accommodations that you've received from SSD, and take those into account when you're creating something or posting something. I know I'm one that likes to have a PowerPoint that has really nice, relevant pictures and maximize the space on the slide. But here's the thing. If I do that, I have to go back and make sure that a person who uses a screen reader could read it. And that the font is not too small or too faint. You can write in yellow, but why? It's too light. You could write in yellow on a black screen, and that would be okay. But if you're trying to write in a really light color on a white screen, please think about that again, or view the show yourself before you do. Um, if you have students who have auditory needs, like maybe they're a very auditory learner, or maybe they have a hearing impairment, then you would have had accommodations about that. So think about when you're lecturing face to face, of course, a student could have the accommodation of an FM system or even a sign language interpreter. Now, I will give you the caveat. Currently, we do not have students using that accommodation. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't, because it's a very real common accommodation. So if you do have that, just kind of keep that in mind. So when you're working with someone who has an auditory impairment, it's really important to consider the visuals. So that might be the time that you really bring in the visuals, add some pictures. That might be the time, if you're teaching online, that you have a PowerPoint with a voiceover, or that you show, maybe you're using Blackboard Collaborate and you use the whiteboard so they can see, or you share your screen so that they can see. It's good to provide the visual because it helps to bridge that gap between what they can hear and understand and then what the whole message is. So think about that. We don't have anyone, but if you did have a need, if someone did have that accommodation of the interpreter or the FM system, the university would assist with that, and that would come from me. Also, this is something that you may think is a no-brainer, and it is a no-brainer when you're face-to-face. Thinking about the fact that we need to be explicit and specific. When we are giving directions to students and when we are asking them to complete a task, we need to be specific with what the expectations are for the task. Will there be a rubric? How much time do they have? What can they use? Now, as the SSD director, I've had some questions raised from students and professors, but primarily from students, asking while we've been on the online learning about an accommodation or a confusion about a test. One student reached out to me and said, we had a math test. I'm worried because I didn't have a formula chart. And normally they provide us a formula chart. Well, so there's a couple of things. It was an online test. The student was at home like all the other students, and he was taking the test. So I'm assuming that the professor was thinking the student will use the tools they need. But I'm also thinking this particular student has a learning disability and he's very concrete. So he was trying to follow the rules and he took the test without using any extra resources. He had a really hard time. So I kind of guided him through emailing the professor and talking through it to get it resolved. But just remember that you can't really assume that someone understands, that there are some conditions and disabilities that make the person not think deeply in the abstract sense. So just think about what kind of like giving someone directions who's never done that activity before. What are you okay with them doing? So when you're putting something on Blackboard, for example, write some directions that explain. Like I'm given a test, so I wrote in there, respond to each question. If I want them to respond in a complete sentence, then I need to say that. Respond to each question in a complete sentence. If I'm okay with them using their notes, most of them would already figure that out that they could, but I need to say it for the ones who don't. So I would write, respond to each question. Short answer questions need to have a complete sentence for a response, and you may use your textbook, notes, and other resources. And I'm letting them know that, right? So I think it's important to think about that because we do have students who have conditions like learning disabilities, ADHD, speech language deficits, and also we have students with autism. And our students with autism do not understand when they're not getting those subtleties of language. So it's not that they're not incredibly bright, but we have to explain specifically what we're looking for. That might even go to the fact that they may not understand, or maybe not that they don't understand, but they're having trouble using the correct system to turn in work or to reach out to the professor. So I would say I have had people reach out to me and say, hey, I'm having a hard time turning my work in on Blackboard. So what I've done then is communicate with the professor and the student and said, hey, we've gone through a little tutorial. If the student continues to have a trouble, do you mind if they email you the paper, or would you like them to contact you? What's the best way? Because we want to ease the stress on both ends, but we also want to realize the goal is for the student to turn in the work. And I know that we want everyone to turn it in on Blackboard the way that we assigned it, but during this time, the student is not getting the face-to-face contact, and they're not getting the body language and the personal conversation that you would have provided if you would have seen them in face-to-face. So, that's just something to consider. I think there's some other things to consider, like when you are providing extra time for a student who has extra time. Well, if I'm giving a test on Blackboard, then I need to program that test to provide that extra time. So I would have to go into the settings and set it up for that student for the amount of time that they have. Now, I did send out something, and there is something posted for instructors, and it tells how to make that adjustment. But if you have trouble with that, please reach out to me because I'm happy to help you. But what that would look like is if a student has a specific accommodation, then their login, when they log in, would be to the test that you created for them. So I can be giving a test in English 1301, and most of my students would have 60 minutes to take it. But if my student has 1.5 times for the test, then they're going to have 90 minutes. And so I would when I assigned it to the students, I would list out who's going to do the 60 minutes and who's going to do the 90-minute version. Because I want to make sure that when they open it, it's the right one. And the other thing is, because you don't want it to time out. You don't want the time to end before the student has had a chance. One thing I do want to also bring up is that we have students who have some accommodations like extended time, like limited flexibility with deadlines would be the accommodation. So there's a lot of discussion about that. Right now, we have some students who are pretty stressed out, and I'm sure that they're not alone. I'm sure that there are staff members that are equally stressed because they're waiting for assignments to be turned in, and the student hasn't turned them in. So many instructors are being so wonderful with giving a lot of extra time to a lot of students, almost everyone probably, just making some concessions for the fact that we're online, we might have internet issues, we're raising our children and trying to homeschool them. There's a lot of things that might be going on. Maybe the student's a caregiver for an elderly parent or a spouse or whatever it is. So a lot of people are accepting that later work. I do want to point out that it's okay to have a deadline for that. And when you say limited flexibility with deadlines, I don't mean that you assigned it in January and you're letting them turn it in May. You can do that if you feel that you need to and if the circumstance warrants it. But I would say follow the access rights and responsibilities document. Follow that and say, okay, our normal agreement is that you can have 2 days extra or 3 days extra. So then you're expecting that assignment in that 3 days. What I have told my students that I teach is, we know that there's some things that are different, so I need you to communicate with me what that is, so I can know that you're still working on that. So what I do is there's one last assignment in my course, for example, and I'm missing it from a couple of people. So I sent an email out, and the email said, if you haven't turned in XYZ assignment, please do so or reach out to me about it. So one student said, I'm finishing it right now. I was helping my child with their homework for their homeschool. Another said, I am a full-time student and a single parent, and I have a job. And I am working on it, but she had already reached out to me. So I wasn't worried that she wasn't going to turn it in. But I just want to make sure that we have time to put the grades in and that the student is going to have an opportunity to get some credit for it. But I also want to make sure that they're not creating a situation and that I'm not helping create a situation where they cannot catch up. Because if I give too much time to the student, then it's going to be difficult. If I give them to like an unlimited amount of time for everything, then nothing is really due, and then there's not a priority. So kind of think about that. Just like for yourself, you have to give yourself some type of deadline, and you have to, that's why you have it laid out in your syllabus. So it's okay to give the extra time and be flexible, but set that parameter so that they're not either taking advantage or putting everything off till the end, because there's a reason why you paced it out. It fits in the syllabus and in the instructional pattern, but it also is manageable in that way. I think there is I do want to address that when you have a student's accommodations, you also want to make sure that if they do share anything private with you about it, that you're just keeping that private. Most of the time, the student doesn't share the private thing. They share with me. They set it up through SSD, and then you receive a letter, and they receive a letter. If they do happen to share, please do not share it with anyone else, and I don't think anyone would intentionally. You could if someone gave you permission to do so, or if maybe you were meeting with that student and they might have shared it, or you and I were meeting with a student and we shared it, but just right there in that group in a need-to-know situation. The other thing is you want to make sure that when you do have that information, that you are you have the accommodation and information in front of you. You're working with a student to follow that accommodation, but you really can't question why. You can't, like if the student says, I have extra time, I have limited flexibility with deadlines, I need a little bit more time with this paper. It's okay for you to say, I need to know beforehand, before it's due. That's definitely fine, and it's a good practice. But then whenever you do speak to them about it, then at that time, set a time for them to turn it in. And even at the beginning of the semester, when the student is talking to you about it, about their accommodations in general, I think I would say, when you have a limited flexibility with deadlines accommodation that you're needing to use, I want you to reach out and tell me. Because you don't want to say that they're going to turn every single thing in late, and they don't want to turn every single thing in late, to be honest. But you want to set up like what types of assignments would lend themselves to more time. Maybe an in-depth paper or project. I just had my students do a lesson plan assignment. It was pretty long. They had to plan a lesson, plan the activities, plan for IEP accommodations and modifications. So I would expect that that might be an assignment that would need more time. But if you're in 1301 English and we're writing a paper over a series of weeks, and the first week you have to make some brainstorming. The second week you have to do an outline. The third week you have to get 3 sources. Those are things that are already scaffolded and stepped out. So it's okay for you to say, I don't really feel that that is something you need a lot more time on. It is already planned out in the syllabus, way ahead. Of course, if the student became ill during that week or something, that would be different. But just to say that they can have every single thing is not necessary. But I do think sometimes we're missing the step of having that meeting with a student, and I have been driving that home with students as I meet with them, is that they are responsible for reaching out to the professor. So of course right now we're not going to have a face-to-face, but you could meet by Skype or email, however it works. But the student and the professor need to talk because they need to know what each other is expecting, and they need to have a mutually agreed upon plan for the course, including the accommodations. Because there could be things in the course, maybe it's a fast-paced course, and you have to think about, well, if I start letting them have a week on every assignment, then that's going to make it where they're not finishing one thing, but I'm asking them to be finished with something else. So, and that can interfere with being prepared for a test or the final. So just kind of think about that, and it's okay to say, I think we need to sit down and discuss that. I have told students, as you're going to your courses and you're implementing, you're getting your accommodations sent, that's a really good time to stop and reach out. Don't wait until you have a test and you didn't think you got your accommodation. So I believe that's it about that. Most students, just to point out, most students that have accommodations, those accommodations would remain the same for online learning, but I think there might need to be some tweaking. For example, the student I mentioned earlier that didn't know he was allowed to use the chart. Okay, that might be something. The other thing to think about is the student who needs a lot of reinforcement. Will there be a synchronous or asynchronous learning experience that they can go to? What I did on my course is I did some synchronous teaching, and then on the times that they were going to work on their own, I have made some online office hours, sort of, and I set them up on the online course on Blackboard Collaborate, and students can get on if they need more help, or and I have office hours anyway, but what I did is during that time, that would be the class time, I set aside time so that if something comes up, or if they have a question or whatever, they can do that. But I've also encouraged them to reach out during the week as well. But just be thinking about that, and what are some things that might be clarified or need to be clarified. It kind of reminds me of when I was doing my student teaching, and you make your lesson plans, and one of the things you do in your lesson plans is you think about what are the needs of these students in your class. What are the possible things that might come up? Like, what are the possible questions they might ask? How would you respond to that? So maybe when you're kind of planning out for your online, you might think about, what are some possible things that I need to clarify? Maybe I need to clarify, is it APA format? Is it a different format? How many sources do they need to have? And then, like I said, set up some type of way for them to ask questions. I think that's about it for the accessibility and accommodations, but I do want to let you know that I'm here. If you have any questions at all that I can help with, if you need help navigating something, if you need help setting up the time or another accommodation, please let me know. You can reach me at ada@olusa.edu or jghuppel@olusa.edu. And I can be reached by Skype, by email, and if you email me and we need to just talk on the phone, you can let me know and I will give you my cell phone number, and that's just fine too. So I wish everyone well, and please let me know if I can help you in any way.